All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a deeply complex, incredibly urgent reality that's unfolding right now in the Philippines. It's really the story of a vulnerable population caught in a devastating crossfire. On one side, you have this unprecedented escalation of natural disasters driven by climate change. On the other side, a deep-rooted, decades-old armed conflict. And caught right in the middle, bearing the brunt of this dual threat, are the nation's most vulnerable citizens, Filipino children. 3.7 million. I want to let that number just sit with you for a second. This isn't some one-off tragedy or historical anomaly. 3.7 million is the average number of people displaced by natural disasters in the Philippines every single year. Year after year, millions of lives are completely uprooted, homes are washed away, and families are just forced into this relentless, exhausting cycle of survival and recovery.
So let's look at the first front of this crisis, the climate disaster.
To put the environmental threat into perspective, globally, the average sea level rise is about 3.1 centimeters per decade. But in the Philippines, it is rising by 7.6 to 10 centimeters every 10 years. That's literally more than double the global average rate. And when you consider that 60% of the population lives in coastal areas and massive urban hubs like Manila, you realize this isn't just some abstract climate statistic. It is a creeping, existential threat to the ground beneath their feet.
And this macro threat builds into a relentless barrage on the ground. 2011, Tropical Storm Washi. 2012, Typhoon Bofa. 2013, the absolutely historic Super Typhoon Haiyan. Then, jumping to 2016, you see Typhoons Haima and Nokten striking back to back. The absolutely crucial takeaway here is that these are not isolated once-in-a-lifetime events anymore. This is a compounding crisis. Before a community can even finish rebuilding a school or a home, the next storm is already making landfall, continually wearing down their resilience. If we drill down to the micro impact of this relentless weather, the numbers are staggering. 5.9 million. That's the number of children who were directly affected by Typhoon Haiyan alone. Just one storm, and almost 6 million childhoods disrupted. Schools were destroyed, homes were flattened, and families were scattered. You know, what displacement actually means for a child day to day is far more than just sleeping in a temporary tent. It means an immediate loss of education, because schools are either destroyed or they get turned into evacuation centers. It means heavy exposure to waterborne diseases in these overcrowded camps. And most alarmingly, it creates a heightened risk of trafficking and sexual exploitation, plus immense pressure to just drop out of school entirely and enter hazardous child labor, literally just to help their families survive. Now, let's shift gears to the second front line, the shadow of conflict. This conflict isn't your standard, simple, two-sided war. What's known as the Mindanao problem is actually this massive, complex wheel of issues. It's fueled by historical injustices, extreme poverty, marginalization, and endless disputes over land and natural resources. You have separatist groups, insurgents fighting for ideological goals, and really intense clan feuds, all operating in the exact same geographical space. It's a highly explosive mix. When we map these abstract concepts into geographic reality, the density is it's stark. Between 2012 and 2015, incidents of violence, whether that's armed clashes, clan feuds, or violent crime, were incredibly dense across the Mindanao region. For a kid growing up here, violence isn't a story on the evening news. It's the very real backdrop of their daily life. It makes the simple act of walking to school a potentially life-threatening journey. And because of this environment, children face terrifying risks. The UN has internationally recognized 6 grave violations against children, and sadly, all of them have been heavily documented here. Killing or maiming, the recruitment of child soldiers, rape and sexual violence, abduction, deliberate attacks on schools and hospitals, and the denial of humanitarian access. These aren't just tragic casualties of war. These are systemic violations actively committed by various armed actors. To put a number to just one of those violations, 32. There were 32 verified attacks on schools and hospitals between 2012 and 2016. Safe havens are literally being destroyed. We see reports of paramilitary groups and insurgents deliberately targeting educational facilities, or even worse, occupying schools to use them as military command posts, taking places of learning and turning them into active military targets. There's a big misconception about child soldier recruitment that completely shatters when you look closely at the data. Kids are rarely joining armed groups like the NPA or Abu Sayyaf out of some deep ideological fervor. Instead, they're driven by crushing poverty. When there's a total lack of local government services, the armed group might literally be the only entity providing support in a village. Children join for the promise of regular food or a tiny payment, simply to survive or to support their starving family.
So where does the system break down? Let's look at good laws versus harsh realities. Let's start with a really surprising juxtaposition. Best in the world. That is a direct quote from a UN special representative describing the Philippines' legal frameworks for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. On a legislative level, the country is globally praised. They have incredibly robust, comprehensive laws like the Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010. But this builds into an incredibly frustrating paradox. On paper, the reality is ideal. You have world-class laws, national calamity funds, designated no-build zones to keep people safe. But on the ground, decentralization, it means local government units are responsible for actually executing this stuff, and they are often severely undercapacitated and underfunded. Zoning laws get completely ignored, and informal settlements just pop right back up in high-risk floodplains. And then there's the terrifyingly slow pace of aid, which only deepens the crisis. $15 million. Following the absolute devastation of Typhoon Haiyan, there was this massive influx of international and national funds. Over $600 million were intended specifically for social services for those affected. Yet, by February 2015, only $15 million of that specific fund had actually been distributed. When funds just sit there in administrative bottlenecks, families are left languishing in temporary shelters, incredibly vulnerable to the next big storm or local conflict.
Which brings us to a massive, structural blind spot. Children are rarely consulted in planning and implementing community-based recovery projects. Whether a community is trying to rebuild after a super typhoon or trying to recover from a localized armed conflict, the very people whose futures are on the line, the youth, have their voices ignored. The rebuilding process almost never factors in their specific needs for safe spaces, uninterrupted schooling, or psychological recovery.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. How can a nation truly protect its future when its most vulnerable citizens are continually caught in the crossfire of nature's wrath and man-made war? The Philippines definitely has the blueprint on paper, but closing the gap between world-class policy and the harsh on-the-ground reality is the ultimate challenge. It's quite literally a question of survival for millions of children. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. I hope this structured breakdown helped illuminate this really critical issue. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.